Justice and war. What an oxymoron. And yet, since the beginning of time, philosophers have debated what is just war. Why is there a time that war is necessary? And as you move through time, how did they codify those responses? To talk about that, first you have to talk about what is war. A battle between two powers, not simply violence between two groups of people, but two groups that each have their own power, their own authority within their area. And so when we're talking about war, we're talking about states, or the minimum tribes, that had control of an area. Secondly, there had to be motivation. Was it just a lust for more power or land? Or was it something like defense? Or trying to prevent somebody else from being harmed? War has always existed. And as Augustine later wrote, it comes from the very nature of man, that because we are in conflict, our nations will be in conflict. And because some fall short, their motivations will be evil. And he went on to codify reasons that you should go to war. Good reasons to go to war as well. But we're going to look at a couple different ones. We're going to look at Aristotle, who had personal first-hand experience of war, Augustine, and eventually Marcus Aurelius, and I know I'm butchering his name, who is a stoic, was involved in war, but had a very personal way of dealing with it. And so first, Aristotle was a warrior. He had fought and returned and was celebrated as a great warrior. And so it's no surprise he has one of the broadest definitions of what good war would be. He didn't write an outline of when war was good. Instead, it was throughout his teachings. He taught that there was a master and a servant. One who understood logos, who understood at a higher level, and those who did not have understanding. And so, because you had good and lesser, there was a natural order to warfare, that when you were conquered, you were the lesser. And so there was less responsibility to the master in guilt or in negative consequences, a way of justifying warfare. Secondly, as a political tool, he taught that warfare must have virtue. But that's a very broad statement for his position in life, where simply winning in battle was virtue. And unfortunately, he didn't spell this out more. And so you have this person who says there are people at a higher tier than others, who, when the people at the higher tier win in a battle, that's a good thing and reason enough to go to war. And so this seems all permissive. And yet, it was restrained by the fact that he stated it was only for the power and glory of the state. It was not for an individual to go out and to wage war. It was for the greater good. And so, in a way, his ethic was to the community, and that the greater good revolved around that state. It's no surprise then that one of his students turned out to be Alexander the Great, one of the greatest conquerors of all time. For when you come from a background where conquering and warfare is in itself a virtue, And as a philosopher, you seek virtue. He progressed to the next logical conclusion and conquered much of the Greek known world. Augustine was kind of the opposite end of the spectrum. He based most of his teachings on scripture, and so you definitely see the influence of good and evil in the way that he viewed the world. But he also gave concrete rules for when warfare was acceptable and when it wasn't. He had a totally different experience of war. When he was Bishop of Hippo, they were invaded, and his city was burned to the ground. And yet his cathedral was spared because they had heard of his justice and mercy. So he had experienced justice and mercy winning out over violence. And while I am sure he was heartbroken for his city, I also believe that he saw the sparing of his cathedral as a sign of good, that he was doing the right thing. When he talks about warfare, he talks about the need to protect those around you. That it was cowardice to not fight to defend your neighbor. That it was necessary to stop sin. And when I think of what a just war is to me, I go back to World War II, occupied areas from Germany and Japan. The atrocities and the murders of the Germans and the abuses of the Japanese. There was a moral obligation to stop those activities from going forward. And when he talks about sin, I think that's what we're talking about. So even if you're coming at it from an anti-religious view, you still recognize there are things that cannot be accepted or tolerated. He also expected war to deal with invasions, and to avenge injuries between states. And that one was a little harder for me to accept. But I think he was looking at it in the right way when you're talking about a group that has been aggressive and must be stopped from being aggressive against other people. Because when you're talking about a state that has invaded others, they have demonstrated a lack of restraint and propensity to hurting those around them, similar to Iraq after invading Saudi Arabia. Kuwait. They had demonstrated their willingness to use their weapons to hurt and kill other people. And so those weapons had to be destroyed. And we didn't have to stick around afterwards, but we needed to make sure that they could not easily go back from after they had retreated. But he also said that any war that was fought just for a lust of power, cruelty, or wild resistance were evil. And so he also gave us outlines for what we couldn't do. We can't just shoehorn our desire into one of those other categories and say, hey, it's okay. Just because we want to defend ourselves does not mean we can be cruel or unjust. And I think we see a great example of that when we start looking at Marcus Aurelius, the 5th emperor of Rome and a Stoic philosopher, who dealt with war on a daily basis on its northern borders, dealt with civil wars internally, and yet focused instead on moderation and self-discipline. He had the armies to crush those groups, and yet he modeled himself on restraint. Even when dealing with people who had rebelled against him in a civil war, he was merciful. So often, Stoicism is applied as a warrior philosophy now, but it's an empty shell of what it was then and what it can be now. So often now it's boiled down to do what you can and ignore the rest. Don't worry about what you can't change. But really, Stoicism is based on the idea that all things are orderly and balanced. And revenge would make you unbalanced. That a lust for power would make you unbalanced. And so it brings restraint without the outside rules that Augustine later established. It established just warfare based on individual ethics rather than a corporate structure. And even today, when we don't believe that power or that individual, that order came from Zeus, we can still recognize that in our own faith. That God creates order, and that within that structure, we do what we can, and we accept the rest. But we acknowledge the order. We acknowledge the rest of what made Stoicism what it is, and strive to live in balance within the rules that we imply on ourselves. But I wanted to talk about that in reference to war because so often these others were corporate structures. This is what is good for the powers. And in Stoicism, we see that what the person does influences what the community does. As we look at what they said just warfare was, we start to see an outline of how they viewed the world. And to me, it runs a lot of parallels to how we view social justice today. Is it the job of the state? And that if the state does it, it's good? Is it just the way that good and evil is in the world, and that we need to live by certain rules? Or is it the role of the individual to live a just life, and by doing so, brings justice to all? They all have ways of teaching us lessons. And as I've done this project, I have appreciated the way that it outlines what we're dealing with today as a nation. I have really enjoyed this class. Thank you, Dr. Shockley. And my only regret is I didn't take the full course so I could enjoy it longer. Thank you. Have a great day.